Welcome to Breaking the Silence of Design, a bi-monthly vodcast designed to discuss the issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the built environment. My name is Karen Compton, principal of A3K Consulting, and your co-host.
And I'm Gabrielle Bullock, your co-host and director of global diversity for Perkins and Will, and co-hosting this challenging journey. And today we are joined by my friend and IIDA colleague, Angie Lee. As partner and design director of interiors at FXCollaborative, Angie leads the award-winning interiors practice, providing strategic vision and oversight for interior environments across a wide range of scales and project types. Born in Seoul, South Korea, Angie grew up in the Midwest, studied at Carnegie Mellon, and in Paris. Angie was raised by parents who promoted science and music. We have shared conversations and journeys with racism, and today we're going to expand the lens to look at racism as more than a black and brown moment. Angie, welcome. Up to this point, the conversation of race and racism has largely been perceived as a black and brown conversation, as hate crimes and racially motivated incidents have increased some 800% in New York and have continued to increase in major metropolitan cities. Can you lend some perspective on how this watershed moment for the API community?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So, similar to how the Black community has said that George Floyd was not the beginning of the struggles of the Black and Brown community with police brutality or everyday racism, the AAPI community is, for the first time, organizing on a scale that is generating actual constructive noise. There is a sense of coming together, a sense of solidarity, and this is kind of a new and wonderful kind of coming together in the face of all this fear and hatred. If there's anything that qualifies as a watershed moment about what's happening with people who are covered by the AAPI acronym, it's that we're finally speaking up. We're speaking out and finding ways to publicly express the pain and the anger that we would normally endure in silence. In my lifetime, I haven't witnessed anything like this kind of banding together before. It's both deeply moving to know that my experiences are so similar to so many others who are East Asian, Southeast Asian, and Pacific Islander, but also really sad that we've all been gaslighted into staying in our lanes and kind of tricked into dismissing daily aggressions that are both overt and covert.
So Angie, you've been a vocal contributor in our Women of Color in Design call on the issues of race and racism, and have spoken about the model minority myth and its stereotypical impact on the AAPI community. For those who do not know what that myth is, first, can you tell us what the concept is, and then how does it continue to reinforce stereotypes of the AAPI in architecture?
Yeah, so the model minority myth is a comparison trap. It's a kind of icky way of making people feel bad by recognizing the accomplishments of a certain number of people in a group who have managed to succeed under trying circumstances and have been convinced by this cultural and systemic kind of racism that meritocracy is achievable by just working harder and harder than everyone else. It's something that you guys are familiar with, but in the model minority myth, by accepting abuse without complaint and then holding up this model group of people to negate or erase the realities of systemic inequity that Black and brown communities, and even the Asian community, have to deal with is what this whole mythology does. In 1965, the U.S. opened up immigration into the country to select highly educated Asian professionals to essentially repeal the 1943 Chinese Exclusion Act that severely limited the number of Chinese immigrants to like 100 people a year. It wasn't a perfect system for the mostly East and South Asian doctors and lawyers who were given preferential treatment to get into the country. My dad was one of those doctors. And I remember his hospital doing a Christmas skit when I was very young, where they openly mocked Asian doctors in this crazy racist depiction of some guy with his eyes taped back, spewing a bunch of gibberish that was supposed to be Chinese or Japanese. My dad's proud but profoundly injured stoicism as we left that party is something that I see Asian and Asian American people in the profession practice quite often. And I myself practice that level of stoicism, even though it only serves to cover up the problems in the end. But speaking up in the moment is really hard, mostly because litigating every insensitive comment and racial slur, joke, or someone making a declaration that our names are too hard to pronounce is just not feasible. And we all encourage ourselves to be resilient, but for AAPI folks, the expectation is a particular kind of double bind where often our protests are met with denial or silence. Our silence is met with disdain for not being courageous enough to vocalize. And in architecture and design, it manifests in a funny way because you'll see AAPI numbers look good relative to Black and Latinx numbers, but if you follow the drop off when you see the leadership stats, you'll eventually see that there's some inevitable tokenism. As hard earned as elevation to leadership is, it's as Bernice King, Martin Luther King's daughter, says, inclusion doesn't equal equity. Diversity doesn't equal justice. Tolerance doesn't equal love. And it's probably to be expected, but we, this kind of initial tokenism as we enter the ranks of leadership, but we just need to remember that representation is just the beginning.
I've heard some people say that the AAPI community has not been negatively impacted by the model minority myth, is viewed through representation in schools and leadership positions. Angie, what's your perspective on the impact?
Yeah, I've heard that said also. And to me, it just means that this kind of insidious PR campaign, this model minority mythology, is working. It means the smoke and mirrors tactic of white supremacy is effectively obscuring the prejudice and bias against Asians and creating the illusion that people of Asian descent are exempt from hardship or trauma, even in academia and even amongst some in the Asian community about themselves. So when professors tell students to anglicize their names, or universities and companies overlook the quiet Asian for leadership opportunities, and perhaps they sincerely believe racism against Asian people is not a real thing, the negative impact is that of death by 1,000 cuts. In a twisted way, now that we're seeing the racism of 1,000 cuts, metaphorically, turn into physical attacks and loss of life at such a rapid and increased pace, it's a kind of twisted relief to hear people say that they acknowledge what many people of Asian descent know to be true. Being Asian is not a blanket advantage. Asian Americans and people from Asia experience an entire spectrum of biases. We're not a monolithic group. There are so many differences, both nuanced and dramatically obvious, that make up our lives. The kind of consequences we face for operating outside societal expectations as quiet, subservient, hardworking immigrants and the perpetual outsider is kind of brutal, because the denial of our negative experiences and trauma can and is literally putting some of us in the hospital. I have good friends who would tell me today that I'm making up the racism that I faced in my past, and they're skeptical about the possibility even that racism still shapes my daily life and that of my family. But even still, I overcome hesitation to stand up for myself in the face of racism, because in the professional realm or in a leadership tier that I have managed to ascend to, I'm not practiced at this. I'm not good at responding to the counter arguments, the annoyance, or the dismissals that come from people I trust and respect. And even though I know what I know, the negative impact of having to convince people that my world is real is that of, once in a while, a little bit of heartbreak.
Based on the rise of hate crimes in the AAPI community and the continued murders of Black and brown people since last summer, how do you see allyship between the AAPI community and the Black and brown community on the issues of race and social justice?
Well, yeah, I think that if you talk about the power of design and you think about how we want to assume or presume that when you utter that important word design, you assume that it's for good intent. But in fact, sometimes, like in this case, in many cases, it's designed for ill intent. So, kudos to this system design for being so effective. But moving forward, we doing what we're doing right now is incredibly important, because we're creating an alliance that is basically like a remedy to the flawed but this ingenious kind of societal design that's really meant to keep us apart and pit us against each other. And it's easier in a way to fight for people I care about in a community setting, in the Black and brown community, and now in my, what I consider a kind of newly formed community of Asian and AAPI folks, versus just standing up for my own, dealios without feeling like, I have the connectivity that I actually had all along. It's just, having these conversations and moving the progress, moving the needle forward into a more transparent and connected community is it's really kind of just as simple as that.
Angie, it has been a pleasure and an honor to have you with us today to talk about these issues. I really want to thank you. And I also want to thank our sponsors for going along on this journey with us. I want to thank DLR Group for hosting us today, IBI Group, our founding partner, and all of our partners for their investment in this journey and these conversations.
And I want to thank our followers, our subscribers, and our component partners. It's not too late to join the conversation. Subscribe on YouTube, follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter as we push further into our own uncomfortable conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you.